Right. Good afternoon, all. Um, and thank you for joining the Department of Housing's 8th Racial Equity Learning Lab. My name is Ugo Ukasanya. I'm the Equity Officer for the Bureau of Community Engagement, Racial Equity, and Strategic Initiatives. Our learning labs are a series of discussions to deepen our understanding on the devastating effects of systemic housing barriers and ways to explore strategies to combat them. The values of the Chicago Department of Housing is develop and promote quality, affordable, safe, and healthy homes across all 77 communities, putting Chicagoans proximity to resources they need to thrive at every age. So our special guest today is Ms. Leah Rothstein, who is a housing policy expert and the co-author of the upcoming book, Just Action, which is a book that energizes local organizations to win community victories that might finally challenge residential segregation and cascade into a groundswell movement. Ms. Rothstein, along with her father, Richard Rothstein, the author of The Color of Law, have produced a social blueprint for community leaders, concerned residents, and everyday citizens alike, insisting that the private sector take responsibility for redressing the segregation that has played a large part in creating. So without further ado, I will popcorn this to Ms. Leah Rothstein.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you so much, Ugo, and thank you all for having me. It's great to be here be virtually here with you all. I'm going to be talking about Just Action, the book that Ugo mentioned, as well as some about Color of Law. So I'm going to try to get through a lot in a short amount of time to leave time for questions and answers at the end. I'm going to start by talking about this concept of de facto segregation. It's a concept we've likely all heard of. It's how we learn as school kids about how residential segregation in our country was created and developed. We were told that residential segregation happened by private action or personal choice, or it was just a naturally occurring phenomenon. We were told that in the South, the segregation of restaurants, lunch counters, transportation was required by law, but that was a different thing than how neighborhood segregation happened, which wasn't required by law. That's what we're taught. We're taught the de facto segregation idea tells us that it was private actors, realtors, landlords, banks, that refused to rent or sell or finance homes for African Americans in white neighborhoods, or that it was personal choice, that we like living in neighborhoods where people look like us, and so we naturally just segregated ourselves. Or it was an economic issue, that we segregated ourselves by economics, and that aligns with race, and that's why our communities look the way they do. And we look around and we see how segregated we are by race in this country, and we think it's too bad that it happened this way, but there's not much we can do about it. Anything that happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We don't have any agency or any obligation to do anything. And the Supreme Court has agreed with this. Chief Justice John Roberts has written in opinions that because the government had no cause in creating the residential segregation of our country, that it has no obligation to remedy it. Well, many of you may have read or heard of The Color of Law that my dad wrote in 2017. And in it, he called the de facto segregation idea a myth. He said, sure, private action played a role in segregating our communities, but that private action was incentivized and often required explicitly by the government, all levels of government, local, state, federal. And these government actions were as unconstitutional as the segregation of restaurants and transportation in the South. It was maybe sometimes less disguised, not always, but no less powerful, a force, this government segregation of our neighborhoods, and no less a violation of the 5th and 14th Amendments. Now, if we see it this way, once we see the truth that the government created segregation on purpose, we see that we have an obligation, the government does, and we do, to force the government to remedy this segregation. But so far, we haven't yet stepped up to meet this obligation. So one example of how federal policy created segregated communities is after World War II, suburbs were expanding and being created all over the country. There were war veterans coming back, millions of them, starting families, creating the baby boom. They were met with a housing shortage. This was after the Great Depression, when no housing was built, and the war, when it was illegal to use construction materials for civilian purposes. So again, no housing built. So all of these war veterans and their new families had no place to live. So the government decided to step in and create subsidized housing for these working families, but for whites only. And the government decided to do this in suburbs. Now, there were some suburbs at the time, but for the most part, before this period of time, people lived near central cities. Their jobs were in factories, and we didn't have the transportation systems or the highway systems we have today. So people had to live closer to where they worked. Well, with the government subsidies for creating suburbs, our country changed. And one example of this that you've likely all heard of is Levittown, outside of New York City. This was a famous suburb. It was built after World War II by William Levitt. He was the developer there. He decided he was going to build 17,000 homes outside of New York City for working families that couldn't find housing in the city. Now, 17,000 homes is a lot to finance, as I'm sure you're all well aware. He didn't have the money for it. He couldn't get a bank loan to do this because it was very speculative at the time. He had no buyers. We weren't a suburban society. The only way he could finance Levittown was with bank guarantees from the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration would only give these bank guarantees to Levitt and to builders like him across the country if they agreed to only sell their homes to white home buyers and have racial covenants on these homes saying that they could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. Now, the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, didn't stop there. They went farther. They said they wouldn't even subsidize housing developments that were located near African-American neighborhoods. In the manual, it said, and I quote, they wouldn't do this because it would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. So again, this was no accident. This was purely on purpose and not hidden action by the federal government to create neighborhoods for whites that were separate than neighborhoods for African Americans. In the Color of Law, there's a photo. It's a wall, 6 foot high, half-mile long wall in Detroit. It separates a white housing development from a nearby African American neighborhood. This wall was required by the federal government to be built by the developer of the white neighborhood as a condition to get the federally backed loan. So as we can see, this is just one example. Color of Law is full of them, but this shows us that this de facto segregation idea is nonsense. There was nothing accidental or natural about this. It was purely government policy that created this segregation of our country. Now, Levitt and builders like him that use federally backed loans across the country to create suburbs only for whites, he was a bigot. He wasn't shy about it. He said if he was left to his own devices, he wouldn't have sold his homes to African-American homebuyers. But the point is that he wasn't left to his own devices. If the government had told William Levitt, here's your federally backed loan guarantee to build Levittown, but you have to commit to selling these homes on a non-discriminatory basis. Well, if that were the case, Levittown would look very different than it does today. Today, Levittown has only 2% of its population that's African American, and in a surrounding area that's 13% Black. And that's a direct result of the government policies that helped create that suburb. Now, suburbs like Levittown across the country were affordable when they were created. They were affordable to working class families of any race. They were about $100,000 in today's money. Now, as we know, homes in suburbs like Levittown don't cost $100,000. They're $300,000 to $500,000, or some places $1 million or more, well out of reach of working class families of any race if they don't have inherited wealth. Now, the white families who were subsidized to buy into the suburbs after World War II and around that time, they got into affordable homes that then increased in value. And they therefore built their wealth. And they could use that wealth to weather health emergencies, to weather bouts of unemployment, to enjoy their retirements, and most importantly, to hand down wealth to their children to buy houses themselves. Now, this was a benefit that whites were given by being allowed to buy into these suburbs that African Americans were prohibited from benefiting from. Now, that leads us to the wealth disparity between Blacks and whites we see today. African American household income is about 60% of white household income. There's a lot of reasons for that. A whole other talk could be devoted to that. There's things we should do to address that disparity. But the point is that if if we think that African-American household income on average is 60% of white household income, it would be logical to assume that household wealth would be about 60% of white household wealth. You make the same amount of money, you can probably save the same amount of money. But in fact, African-American average household wealth is 5% of white household wealth. And that is a huge disparity. It's due entirely to this unconstitutional government policy that subsidized white families to get into home ownership when it was affordable and prohibited African-Americans from doing so. Now, that wealth gap is a cause of a lot of the racial inequality we see in our country today. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act passed, and it prevented the future discrimination in the sale and rental of housing by race. And that's great. It's great to not discriminate from now into the future, but it did nothing to address this wealth gap that already exists based on previous government policy. So it's sort of an empty promise to say, now we won't discriminate. African Americans can buy houses in any community, when many of these communities they're priced out of because of the very policies that kept them out of them to begin with. So we can see how segregation was created by the government on purpose. And we can also see now, if we start to investigate this, that segregated neighborhoods are to blame for many of our serious social problems in this country. Segregated neighborhoods lead to disparities in health, in income, in education, incarceration rates, exposure to crime between Black and white children and adults. African-American children who grow up in segregated neighborhoods grow up to have more cardiovascular disease, shorter life expectancies, greater cancer rates than whites, even poor whites. And this is partly because they live in communities with more pollution, more lead paint, more stress, less access to healthy food. They suffer more from asthma and lead poisoning, leads to educational disparities. Segregated schools and segregated neighborhoods are overwhelmed by the challenges of students who live in neighborhoods where there's more pollution, more asthma, less access to healthy food, less access to early childhood care and after school programs. So no matter how good the school is in these segregated neighborhoods, they're overwhelmed by the challenges of all their students, and everybody's performance suffers. So Color of Law came out about 5 or 6 years ago. And because of that book, amazingly, the de facto myth of segregation in this country has less currency now. We can more clearly see the costs of segregation and the unconstitutional actions that created and maintain it. And once we do see that, we can see that we have an obligation to remedy it. It's not just a naturally occurring thing that we have to wait to fix itself. We can see it was intentionally created. It's going to take intentional action to undo it and challenge it. So many people who read Color of Law, myself included, who went to my dad's lectures about it, said, it's great that we now see this history more clearly, but what do we do about it now? So my dad convinced me to write a follow-up book with him, Just Action. It'll be available on June 1st. And it describes what we can do in our own communities to begin to redress segregation. And I'll just add that I know you all work in housing and planning, and you address these issues professionally every day. But I'm speaking to you today as residents of your communities, because what we argue in Just Action is that's where this movement has to start. We have to create a new activist civil rights movement that starts locally, that can help you do your jobs professionally to make the change we need to see in our cities and counties, and then nationally. So this new activist civil rights movement, how is it going to happen? Well, as we know, we saw a racial reckoning in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. There were more people marching, more white people marching than ever before to demand justice for Black lives. People came home, they put lawn signs on their front lawns. They went to book clubs to talk about racial justice. There were more companies than ever before writing letters to their shareholders, denouncing racism and promising to do better. This is all great, but these lawn signs and book clubs and letters to shareholders aren't going to change the entrenched living patterns that we're so used to and that just keep continuing to be maintained. These lawn signs, book clubs, letters to shareholders, and other actions like this, they're necessary to build awareness. It's a necessary first step, but then we have to take that awareness and turn it into action. Now, I'm not saying it'll be easy, but what we hope to get across in Just Action is that it's not impossible. In the book, we talk about dozens of policies and strategies. Many of them you're probably familiar with and implementing yourselves in your work. ways to redress segregation locally. We argue that we need a movement that starts locally, that federal policy change will be necessary eventually, but we also are aware that we're not naive, that there isn't the federal sort of national political will to create the interventions and investments needed to redress segregation nationally. So we need to build a local movement first that will then bubble up and create this national movement that we need. So how do we start building this local movement? Well, we can begin by building biracial, multi-ethnic groups to talk about these issues and begin to address them in our communities. This might seem daunting because now, less so than previous generations, we have little cross-race contact outside of workplaces. And in our book, Just Action, we have some examples of how communities have bridged these divides. One of them is in Chicago. I can't see any of your faces, so nodding won't help, but I don't know if you're aware of Tanika Johnson. She's an artist in Chicago, a photographer. She's created a map twins project where, because of how Chicago is laid out, she could fold the map of the city in half, and there would be a house in, okay, great, people know her. There would be a house in the African-American South Side that would lie right on top of a house on the North Side with likely a white homeowner or resident. And she introduced these people, called them map twins, introduced them to each other and had them come to each other's neighborhood, get to know each other, do tours of their neighborhoods. And it created, now they have block twins and they have done community beautification efforts and things like that. So while she didn't do this to create activist organizations, it could be a way to start to build an activist organization. And it is an example of how we can bridge these divides, people who've lived in the same city but don't know people in the other race parts of town. So once these groups are formed, people often start by learning about the history. Thanks for putting that link there. Learn about the history of how their own community segregated, how the nation segregated. This often starts when people discover racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of their own homes. As I said, these covenants were a primary tool of the federal government to create segregation in the mid-20th century. And their covenants on the deeds of a house, on the deed of a house that says that the home can only ever be owned or occupied by whites. And while that's no longer legally enforceable, they remain on the deeds forever. And so people have found these. We talk about folks in Modesto, California, Rochester, New York, Charlottesville, Virginia, where homeowners discovered these on the deeds of their own homes, and they were shocked. They were surprised to see how intentionally their own community was segregated. And they started investigating, creating maps and crowdsourcing information about where the deeds existed. And through that, we're able to raise awareness and inspire action amongst their neighbors. So, as I said, Just Action describes strategies we can take locally, and I'll get into a couple of those in a minute. But we argue in the book that the strategies that we need to take on have to be sort of two-pronged. We need to look at both the strategies that end segregation going forward so that these patterns are not maintained and duplicated into the future. And we also need strategies that redress the harms of the past. We need to address that wealth gap. We need to right the wrongs of the past if we're going to move forward and truly redress segregation. So we group the strategies that we talk about into two main categories. And they're housing policy terms, which I'm sure you're familiar with. The first category are called place-based strategies. These are strategies that are concerned with investing resources in lower income segregated communities where the concentration of poverty is a direct result of government-sponsored segregation. Place-based strategies also include anti-displacement strategies so that as investment in these neighborhoods increases, the people who've lived there for a long time aren't displaced just as they start to become places with more resources and more amenities. So these anti-displacement strategies include rent control, just cause eviction ordinances, inclusionary zoning, that sort of thing. One place-based strategy that's used in over 200 communities across the country, I'm not sure if Chicago has one, is a land trust. Land trusts are able to maintain affordable housing in perpetuity when prices rise in a neighborhood. So as communities gentrify, a land trust can create permanently affordable housing and also provide home ownership opportunities to low and moderate income households in those communities. It's a lot to accomplish in one organization, and they do this by acquiring property, often through local government giving unused land to a land trust, and that will only happen if there's a movement advocating to support that move by the government. So the land trust acquires property, it rehabs or builds a home on the property, and then it sells that home to a lower moderate income family who can afford the monthly payments, but likely can't afford market prices in the neighborhood because the prices are rising. Now, the trust keeps that home affordable because it maintains ownership of the land underneath the house. Now, rising land prices are one of the main drivers of increasing housing unaffordability. So by keeping the land price out of the cost of the home, it keeps the house affordable. And in return, the home buyer, the family that buys the home, agrees that when they sell, they will abide by a formula that the trust establishes saying what the maximum resale price can be so that it's affordable to the next family buying it. That's how it maintains permanent affordability. You know, every trust balances the ability to keep the home affordable in the long term with the ability of the home sellers to gain some equity. So every trust uses a slightly different formula, but they all try to balance those two goals while they do it. One example is in Durham, North Carolina. They have a trust called the Durham Land Trust. It started when some residents of a lower income African-American neighborhood there started organizing around issues that were important to them. They started by trying to get the city to turn a vacant lot into a park. That was a long promised park that the neighborhood was waiting for, and kids in the neighborhood had no safe place to play. A child had been hit by a car. So they advocated to get this park and they won it. And that galvanized the group to think that what else could they do in their community to improve their conditions? Well, at the time, their neighborhood was gentrifying. This neighborhood, the Birch Avenue community, it's near Duke University, and the university was expanding. So investors saw an opportunity. They were buying up homes to fix up and sell or rent at higher prices to the Duke University community and to students, and threatening to displace the residents of that community. So the land trust wanted to fight this, to prevent this. They started with 2 homes that were vacant, fixed them up, and sold them to low and moderate income households. The first buyer bought one of the homes for $100,000 in today's money, a lot less than homes were going for at the time. And homes in the trust portfolio now sell for about $150,000, which is higher than it was when it started, about $50,000 higher, so slightly less affordable now. But when you consider that other homes in the neighborhood are now selling for $500,000, they've really effectively created some long-term affordable housing there. It's also been an effective anti-displacement strategy. The blocks in this neighborhood where the trust was able to acquire homes are still mostly African-American, while the surrounding blocks where the investors outpaced the trust in buying property, most of the residents are now white. So this is an effective strategy for investing in lower income segregated communities and helping prevent displacement and create home ownership opportunities. So what can we do about it in our own communities? Well, individually, we can donate or volunteer if there's a trust in our community. But most importantly, and you'll hear this theme as I talk, is what we can do together, which is join a group or start a campaign that would pressure the local government and local institutions to fund a local land trust to ensure that it has the resources it needs to continue to expand its property holdings and create more homeownership opportunities in those neighborhoods. So that's a place-based strategy concerned with increasing investment in lower income segregated communities. The other category of strategies we talk about are mobility strategies. These are concerned with opening up, oh great, the Chicago Housing Trust. Awesome, thank you. Opening up exclusive white neighborhoods to diverse residents. So these include things like zoning changes, subsidies for African Americans to move into these communities, inclusionary zoning again. They also include strategies that protect these communities' integration as they start to diversify to prevent white flight and prevent them from flipping to be segregated white neighborhood to a segregated African-American neighborhood. One effective mobility strategy concerns Section 8. You've all probably heard of the Section 8 program, the housing voucher for rental housing administered by local housing authorities funded by the federal government. There are currently 2 million low-income households, disproportionately African-American, that receive Section 8 vouchers around the country. Another 4 million that are eligible and there aren't enough vouchers for them. That's another topic for another time. But 2 million is a lot. And vouchers give these families the ability to rent in the private market. So unlike public housing recipient, their benefit comes with a place. It comes tied to a specific unit in a specific building. But Section 8 allows the voucher recipient to use that voucher to rent anywhere in the jurisdiction. Now, most of us want to live in neighborhoods with low crime, with well-resourced schools and open space and access to good jobs and transportation. We call these areas of high opportunity. Children who grow up in these areas do better. They have better education, better health, better income outcomes. As adults, their parents have less stress and depression. But not surprisingly, low-income families don't often live in areas of high opportunity, and that's because these communities are designed to keep low-income people out by being too expensive for them to live there. Now, Section 8 has the potential and had the intent to address this by allowing voucher recipients to use their voucher anywhere, including in these high opportunity areas. But only 5% of Section 8 voucher holders live in high opportunity neighborhoods, and whites are more likely to than Blacks. Now, one of the reasons for this is discrimination. Discrimination against voucher holders is allowed by the federal government, but many states and localities outlaw it, including the state of Illinois, Cook County, and Chicago, all have source of income discrimination ordinances. They all have various levels of rigor and relief provided for those who experience discrimination. But passing a law, as we all know, is just the first step. Discrimination often still happens against voucher holders, even in places where these laws exist. So it takes education, monitoring, and enforcement to make sure that the laws are adhered to and that voucher holders don't experience discrimination. And it's up to the work of fair housing organizations. Often it's fair housing organizations or civil rights organizations that do the monitoring and enforcement of these anti-discrimination laws. And we can support those fair housing organizations by ensuring they have the resources they need to do this work, and also individually to volunteer as testers with fair housing organizations. And that's when people, a white prospective tenant and an African-American prospective tenant with the same qualifications apply for the same unit to see how they're treated by the landlord, to be able to tease out where discrimination is occurring so that then the fair housing organization can do something about that discrimination. But they need volunteers to be able to do that testing. It's a costly endeavor, but it's necessary to tease out discrimination. So we could all volunteer to do that locally. Excuse me. So that's discrimination. There's also, even in places where discrimination is outlawed and say it's even well enforced, that ordinance, the voucher amount itself is also an obstacle to voucher holders' mobility out of high poverty neighborhoods to low poverty neighborhoods. And that's because the way the voucher is designed, the voucher holder pays 30% of their income on their rent, and the voucher pays the rest up to a maximum voucher amount, which is set on to be slightly below the median of the metro area's market rents. So a metropolitan area like Chicago, very large, probably a very large span in rent amounts across the metropolitan area. So you go to halfway between the highest rent and the lowest rent, and 10% below that, that's the maximum rent a voucher will support in the area. Now, by definition, that means that over half of the rentals in the metropolitan area are out of reach of voucher holders. Not surprisingly, these are in areas that are high opportunity areas where rents are more expensive. Now, there was a lawsuit in 2010 in Dallas that alleged that this voucher payment standard caused the segregation and isolation of Black and Hispanic voucher holders into high poverty neighborhoods. As a result of the lawsuit, the public housing authorities in the Dallas area adopted a different rent standard that's based on smaller areas called the small area fair market rent. And so they take a zip code or a group of zip codes and use the median rent for that small area to determine the maximum voucher amount in that area. So areas with higher rents, the voucher goes farther than areas with lower rents, and that makes sense. And it allowed for voucher holders to have more ability to move into high opportunity neighborhoods. Now there are 180 housing authorities in 24 metropolitan areas that are required by HUD to use these small area rents. The only one in Illinois, I don't know if there are any in Illinois, but Chicago is not one of the ones required to use this. But other housing authorities can voluntarily adopt the small area rent standard, so local advocates can pressure their housing authority to use this and to give more mobility chances to voucher holders. Now, in other areas, aside from the payment standard and anti-discrimination laws, some areas have started mobility programs that are comprehensive programs to help voucher holders move to high opportunity neighborhoods. These programs usually have counselors to help the voucher holders find the units, apply for them, and help them with their moves. They usually recruit landlords in these neighborhoods to help get them to agree to rent to voucher holders. And they provide financial assistance for higher security deposits and rental application fees and moving expenses. Now, Milwaukee is a place we've been following that has a program like this. It has all of these features, it's well funded, but the area does not use the small area fair market rents outside of a few select zip codes in Milwaukee. So most of the people in the program can't find places they can afford with their voucher. So this is an example of where an organized local group of advocates could really help. They could help get a rent standard, a small area rent standard adopted, and help pass anti-discrimination ordinances in their cities and counties. So that's a Section 8, that's one mobility strategy. And just to go back really quickly to the land trust example, I talked about that as a place-based strategy, as a strategy used in lower income segregated communities, because that's where land trusts often operate, because that's where they can afford to acquire land. But if a land trust could acquire land in a suburb, in an exclusive suburb, it would go a long way to support mobility goals in that area. Activist groups could get suburbs to donate land, and that opportunity does exist. We describe in Just Action a few of these. In Woodbridge, Connecticut, there's a country club that the town purchased when it went bankrupt. In Modesto, California, a golf course, similar story. In a lot of suburbs, there's unused public school land as the public school enrollment has decreased. So there's land available that could be donated to a land trust in these exclusive suburbs. And a land trust could then build homes on this land and provide affordable homeownership opportunities that remain affordable permanently to people who've historically been excluded from these communities. Again, this won't happen in these suburbs without an organized group of residents in that area pressuring the local government to do this and convincing their neighbors to accept it. So aside from place-based and mobility strategies, we also talk about some that span both of these goals, so they don't fit neatly into these two boxes. And that includes things like increasing homeownership opportunities through down payment assistance programs, homeownership counseling, subsidies for African Americans to buy homes. African Americans have been denied homeownership in obvious ways, like the racial covenants I talked about earlier. Also, presently in less obvious ways, like the credit scoring system. So the credit score, as we're probably all familiar with, credit score is based on your financial history. It's supposed to be an objective rating of your ability or likelihood of repaying a loan in the future. So if you have a high credit score, a bank seems to think you'd be a better mortgage holder and you're more likely to get a mortgage and lower interest rates than if you have a low score. Now, if you have a history of defaulting on a loan, you have a low score, and that makes sense. But if you have a financial history that isn't recognized by the credit scoring system, like you've been a renter for a long time, or you've borrowed money in ways that banks don't recognize, you don't get any credit towards your credit score for that kind of borrowing history, no matter how faithfully you've paid back your obligations. So renters who've never missed a payment don't get good credit scores because of this. African Americans are more likely to be renters and live in neighborhoods that don't have banks, have more payday loan offices, other financial institutions that aren't recognized in the credit scoring system. And so no matter how well they do at paying these back or paying their rent on time, paying utility bills, they have lower average credit scores because of this. Now, this is an example of a practice that isn't intentionally racially discriminatory, but is in practice. And there is something we can do about it. Rent history is as good of an indication as anything about how well you'll be able to pay future bills, especially because often rents are higher than mortgage cost. So if you've been able to pay your rent for the last 30 years, you should be able to pay a mortgage that's that same cost or lower. But banks don't take this into account. Now, there's a movement around the country to change this, and there's been some steps to start taking rental payment history into account in credit scores. But as we wait for the national sort of scene to change around that, we can do a lot locally to get local banks and credit unions to start using rental payment history and utility payment history in their own algorithms for figuring out credit scores. Some have done this and more should. An organized group of residents can work with their local banks to do this. It would do a lot to open up home ownership opportunities for African Americans. So that's sort of a little overview, a couple examples from Just Action. There's many, many more. And I'll just end by saying that we need all of these types of strategies. You all being in the housing world may be aware that there's a debate between whether we should focus on place-based strategies and investing in lower income communities over mobility strategies and opening up exclusive communities to diverse residents. And we argue that we have so far to go and so much that needs changing that we can't afford to be choosy. All of these strategies will help and all will ultimately be necessary. And it matters fairly little where we start, as long as we start somewhere in our own communities and start to build a movement around this. So we hope that this book, when it comes out in a few months, helps to start that conversation. And I appreciate you listening, and I believe we have some time now for Q&A.
Thank you, Leah, for this discussion. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions you may have, as well as drop any questions in the chat.
Thank you all. I'm trying to read the chat to see if I missed any question, but feel free to tell me if there's one in there I should be looking at.
Yeah, I have a quick question. So I'm always looking at history to kind of inform the present. And I remember, I want you to verify something I may have read in Color Law that I always cite, essentially. When you mentioned that homeowners at Levittown were provided with subsidies, could you confirm if those subsidies came in the form of zero down payment, 0% interest on those homes specifically? I think about what it was like to buy like the condos and my friends buying property right now at this age, and those rates and those amounts are not the same as what they were presented back in the early 50s. So I was just curious if you can confirm that information.
I don't know the specifics of what the interest rates were on those loans, but I do know that it was the government-backed loan, the loan guarantee on the loan that Levitt got to build those houses that allowed it to be that affordable. So $100,000 for a brand new house in a new subdivision is kind of insane to think about now. And there were programs through the VA that gave very low interest rates, low down payment loans only to white veterans. But I don't know the exact numbers of what those interest rates were offhand.
I think, yeah, that's correct, that it was through VA loans now that you mention it. But it's something that I always cite to my friends and family when we talk about generational wealth. So thanks again for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you. I love these comments about that you all had Tanika on a podcast and you're working with her. Another piece of her work that we touch on a little bit in Just Action, we have a picture that shows it is, we talk about contract sales, which was something that happened a lot in the 40s and 50s to African-American families, where they thought they were getting a normal mortgage, a conventional mortgage, but really they were just getting a contract for a home where if they miss one payment, they lost the entire home, any equity, any repairs they made on it. And it was often manipulated to make them miss a payment and then resell the home at a higher price to another African-American family. There's a whole scheme. We get into it where speculators made tons of money. Banks financed them. Banks went under in these schemes because the whole scheme was, it didn't work by exploiting families over and over. But Tanika Johnson is starting another project where she's putting plaques in front of some homes that were sold on contract in the 40s and 50s so that we can start to see how prevalent this was. And she's trying to get funding to buy one of the homes and turn it into a museum. And we would argue, and I think she's working on this as well, is to put plaques in front of the banks that financed the scheme that still exists today, or their successors do, and haven't been held to account for what they did to impoverish Black communities.
Miss Leah, I want to thank you. I put some comments in the chat thanking you for your presentation. I thought it was awesome. My name is Karen Forte. I am a member of CHA's Landlord Council, and they talk about mobility program and opportunity program. And I just want to say to my fellow colleagues, when you're looking to invest in our communities, which is what I did 25 years ago, I specifically placed myself in a situation to buy property that was in the opportunity program so that I could give back. So I dedicated the units that I own to making sure that we stay in moderate rents, continuing to work in those programs. And you are right, some of these rents are just as much or more than a mortgage. I never use credit scores when I am interviewing tenants because people get into circumstances sometimes. And sometimes people just need an opportunity. So I thought this was great. And I just wanted you to know I appreciate you for giving this presentation. I hope that I can get CHA to have you come in and present to the owner council so that they can hear what you have to say, because it's moving.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
thank you
for what you do.
Thank you.
I would say we talk a lot about policy changes and huge interventions, but what you're mentioning is a huge piece of the puzzle too, which is we all, or many of us, know landlords or are landlords ourselves, and that individual action makes a difference.
It does. It does.
Yeah. And I believe we will be out in Chicago. I don't know for sure, but I think we will be out in Chicago around our book launch, the beginning of June. So maybe I could contact somebody and see if we can tack on some other presentations while we're there.
Okay. Yep.
I'll put my email in the chat and feel free to
get
in touch with me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about small landlords, I had a follow-up question. I'm with the Commission on Human Relations, and we handle discrimination cases in housing, public accommodation, and employment. We talk a lot about, the big real estate companies, the megaplexes and all that, but it's the small landlords that we've been struggling with trying to figure out the best way to reach them, how to educate them, and how to stop them from discriminating. Are you aware of any successful programs across the country that you've seen that address that?
I'm not offhand. I think from what I've heard is there's nothing, no sort of magic bullet, but just organizing people and getting groups together and people talking to their neighbors. And but I would love to hear if you come up with anything.
All right. Okay. That's something we'll continue to work on. So, all right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Gunn, Karen, again, it's interesting that you say that, because as some of my friends who own property tend to discriminate against certain situations, I always have these conversations with them about not doing that. and to find the benefit. I don't want to use any acronyms in particular, but to find the benefits and supporting certain areas that may be considered challenging and just trying again, giving the person an opportunity. So I think one person at a time, one owner at a time may be helpful in that regard. And then you too maybe can come out and have a conversation with owner council about these very matters.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm gonna be quiet now.
And I have just to clarify, I actually have the book here, Color of Law. A really fantastic book. But can you speak more of the University of Chicago? Because it says in the book that University of Chicago actually subsidized associations from 1933 to 1947 to prevent African Americans from actually coming into Hyde Park. So can you speak more on it and the effects it still has today, seeing how, you see the clear segregation between Hyde Park and Woodlawn in terms of area median income. So can you speak more on that? And also, is there any other universities around the country that actually took part in subsidizing organizations to prevent African Americans from moving into neighborhoods?
Okay, so my dad's the historian and I'm more of the current policy person. So I can't speak to the specifics of the history and color of law. He would have to do that. So I don't know the specifics, but I'm sure that there were other universities that did that. I know I've heard of them and I can't pull them out right now, but yeah, by subsidized, I mean, in the same way that the suburbs like Levittown that I mentioned were subsidized and at the time that they were built and the prices were affordable, it was acceptable to make them racially restrictive. So that's how, home ownership associations would do it. They currently have other tactics to make racially restrictive associations for smaller, subdivisions and homes. And then as those, because those areas were then subsidized and got federally backed loans, they got conventional mortgages because of how redlining, allowed those areas, because they were all white, to be able to get conventional mortgages. They increased in their resources. People there built equity. The houses increased in value. And now those who aren't wealthy can't afford to live there, but they would have been able to when they were begun. So a current example, this isn't a university, but we talked to some folks in Dallas because they have the small area rent standard for Section 8 voucher amounts. That in the higher cost areas of Dallas, the voucher amount is worth more. So it's worth it there's some small firms that buy up single family homes in the suburbs of Dallas and rent them specifically to Section 8 families. And they can make a small profit because the voucher amounts are high enough there, and they provide this stable housing and good communities for these families. And one of the communities where they do this is called Providence Village. It's a small suburb, mostly white, middle class, 2,000 homes, I think. Their homeownership association recently voted to ban Section 8 tenants from their community. And there are 157 Section 8 tenants in that community when they took that vote. And HUD has they've stopped, they're investigating the racial motivation behind that. So it currently is unenforceable. So folks haven't been evicted yet, but they sort of have this eviction notice if the law is allowed to go through. So there are still ways that these communities are maintaining the racial boundaries, trying to, and it takes litigation, and then it also takes organizing to keep them from doing that. And these exclusive white communities will often always use any tactic they can to try to maintain their exclusivity, their high property values, all these euphemisms for keeping them mostly white and high cost. And, as we say for Providence Village, it's highly unlikely that 100% of the residents there support this exclusionary tactic. And so if there were an organizer there to find the residents who didn't agree with it and start to organize it against it, real change could happen there and protect the families to stay in that community.
Thank you. Thank you. We have 5 minutes left. Please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask any last questions.
Yeah, hi Leah. Nice to meet you virtually.
Thank you.
I'm curious if you think there's a role. I mean, it sounds like a lot of what you're talking about in this upcoming book is kind of working within the market as it is to sort of better organize people. But I'm wondering if you think if there's a role, or if you address public banking, for example, and what its role might be in housing equity. Obviously, yeah, and I think a lot about, for example, Auburn Gresham, here in Chicago, was devastated by the 2008 mortgage crisis, and a lot of homeowners obviously lost their homes. If, say, those mortgages were held by a public bank entity or something, that there could have been a local decision made to not kick those people out of their homes. So that was a period of extreme wealth loss for the Black community, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, there's been no recovery since then. So that, and then also potentially providing low interest mortgages or any other kind of lending, because lending access to credit is I'm sure you're aware, is a major issue in our communities.
Yeah, that's a great question. We didn't get into sort of communities starting their own banks, but that's an interesting strategy to take on, something I'll look into.
I know there's efforts in, like, I believe it pretty far forward in LA, Philadelphia, New York. So
great, thank you I'll look into that. We do talk about, there's this is again within the traditional structure of the market as we have it, but banks do have the authority to have race-based mortgage programs to serve underserved communities that have been discriminated against by the banking industry. If they can prove that, which isn't hard to do, then they can start a mortgage program that is focused by race to provide, beneficial mortgages, low interest rates, low down payments for African Americans. And they're starting to do it. This has been on the books since the 70s, I think, this laws, but most banks haven't done anything about it because they're afraid of litigation for being race conscious, because that's where we are right now in terms of the laws. But they're allowed to, and so they're starting to be more movement around it. They're like starting tentatively. So I think it's Bank of America and Chase Bank now have programs that give this mortgage, beneficial mortgage program to people buying homes in Black or Latino communities, which is good. But what they should be doing is giving these good mortgages to Black and Latino homeowners to buy anywhere. Otherwise, they're just perpetuating the segregation that they helped create. But it's a start, and there's a lot of movement around this now.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. All right. So thank you all for joining. This is really fantastic discussion. Really thank you, Leah, for joining us. For the rest of 2023, we have some great presenters coming for our Racial Equity Learning Lab. So stay tuned. We definitely sending out this recording afterwards, so you can always go back and listen. I really appreciate you all for joining.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sorry, David, I meant to send that to everybody. Sorry.
No worries.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Miss Leah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.